Bona nit, good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Apora, the association, and Trespa for inviting us and for setting this series of lectures. Also, I would like to thank you, Andy, for accepting our invitation. So very welcome to Barcelona once again.
Thank you very much. I'm very impressed at how many of you have managed to turn up on what I understand is quite a difficult day in Barcelona, but yeah. So thank you.
So I'll start, well, Omar has already introduced you a little bit, but I will also start introducing a little bit the studio. Andy Grove is founding partner of Carmody Grove, which is an architectural practice, as Omar has said, that was founded in 2006, based in London, by Kevin Carmody and Andy Grove, developing a wide range of art, cultural heritage, and residential projects. Today, Andy and I have set 7 topics, more or less, which will drive our conversation. With a background, how should I set the presentation? Okay, great, thank you. So, and we're always setting a background of pairs of images that set a kind of collection of opposites. So let's start from how Andy and I met. We met in 2011 at the Architectural Review Awards event. I remember that you were awarded by the dining. We were highly commended with Ferreria's Cultural Center. So we met there at this event, and since then our lives has been crossing once and again. A lot has happened since then, but we've been lecturing together at the RABA and then in Piron with a jury, I remember, then again in the exhibition in Girona and with Ramon Sanabria. So I have to say that I have always felt that there's a kind of common ground between our practices. Maybe it's, I'm just wondering if we could talk about the generation, Andy. What do you think about that?
Well, Olga, as you say, we established our practices in more or less the same year. So I guess in time explanation, we're in the same generation of studios. And I think what, on reflection, has defined our generation as any generation of architectural studios is really the circumstances of what's happening in the wider world, what's happening in the cultural but economic, social happenstances of the economy and culture as a whole. And I think that to a greater or lesser extent gives you a sort of strategy for how you make your work make sense of those times, but it also gives you tactics about how to get work, to practice architecture, to test ideas, and to speculate in what we're trained to do. Hopefully, in physical terms of making buildings. I think setting up in 2006, it was a very enjoyable time to practice. There were lots of clients around, there were lots of opportunities around. And then in 2007, the world fell off a cliff. And we, in our generation, I would say, in the global recession, we had to look to very unusual strategies of making architecture and also very unusual tactical ways of making opportunities. And so, to a certain extent, I would say our generation are often working on the margins of conventional architecture, and maybe like other generations, picking up on the scraps that are leaving the tables from the generations above. But we're really kind of hunter-gatherers, and maybe defined in different geographical ways, but hunter-gatherers looking for opportunities to practice.
Yeah, completely agree. And what about London? Do you think we could also, well, your office is set in London, and do you think we can also talk about UK generation there?
So I think London as a city, we have an aerial image of London as it sort of was 2 years ago. It's probably completely unrecognizable as that same aerial photograph today. The skyline is changing on an almost daily basis. And on the right-hand side, we have an etching made in 1751 by satirical artist William Hogarth. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I think London is a very, very interesting city. It's patently a mercantile city. It's shaped by internal and external forces, by economic and cultural and creative forces. And I think it gives particular shape to the way one practices as a young studio starting off, as a studio that gradually establishes with commissions, and a studio that gets to a point where they've got to sustain a studio. So there's a certain way of practicing in London which I think is very particular to London. I don't think we can stand aside from the conspiracy that we sit within. And I think to enjoy practicing in a metropolis, I think you have to stand with one foot in that conspiracy of circumstances. But I think you have to keep one eye on other agendas, on what makes good architecture, but what makes good cities. The etching, the William Hogarth etching, is particularly interesting to us. It's, as I say, drawn in 1751 by an artist that was particularly interested in the successes and failures of the city. He wasn't an artist that was patronized by kings and queens, by the church. He was drawing real life of the city in all of its positives and negatives. And here we see this etching is called Gin Lane, and it depicts a population of the rich and poor getting to grips with a gin addiction, looking at the ills of the city as well as the wealthy. And I think for us also, in the background, it depicts some of London as its physical presence. And if one compares these two images, you can sort of project a certain resilience of London as an organism, as a body politic, as a physically present construct. And I think what's interesting to us is that resilience of London, of architecture that somehow shows and records the traces of people's lives, the passage of time, but also shows us the resilience of architecture and how it should respond to the needs of making good cities. And one final point about this image, and why we're particularly really fond of it, and why it's a really personal image to us, is it depicts the view that almost we got from our first studio window. So this is a drawing in 1751, and we set up our studio on the same street, more or less, as William Hogarth was sketching in 2006. And one can see the traces of the same architecture, the resilience of this architecture that never seems to go away, that seems to be built upon again and again and again, and somehow embeds these traces of people's lives into it.
So somehow we could say that here is where everything started.
Yeah. Somehow, yeah.
So it started in London, but neither Kevin or you are from London. Actually, you are from Manchester. Kevin is from Australia. So what can you say about your cities?
So we each chose to make London our home. We followed where the opportunities to work and practice as architects were. shortly before the turn of the century. Gosh, that sounds a long time ago. Kevin's very glamorous background is he's Australian, so this is an image from a drawing of Canberra by Walter Burley Griffin, drawn in, I believe, 1911, when Canberra was being imagined as the capital of Australia. It was a project to make a new city in new territory, and this was a project which was partially realised for a city of 3 million people. Now, Canberra was built out and became the capital, and only built out to a density of 300,000. So I think what interests Kevin time and again about this image and growing up in this place is the notion of density, and comparing this to the European city, the plan and the reality of the utopian vision of the density of suburbia, and there are obviously clear climatological comparisons to make with perhaps a place like Barcelona, but coupling the environmental and cultural and political, economic differences of this place, we have a totally different viewpoint to my background, a totally different viewpoint on place and territory and landscape and how you move through the land. And I grew up in a very, very different place. I grew up near Manchester, and Manchester has this very, very deep, rich history of a Roman settlement being built upon in several slow and rapid phases, and being almost one of the foundation stones of the Industrial Revolution, seeing enormous development in Georgian and Victorian times, and seeing a big vision for the city, a big vision for a dense city, a big vision for philanthropic architecture, and yet in the 1970s and 80s, when I was growing up in the city, and the image on the right-hand side shows some 1970s cars in a disused railway shed. It was Central Station in Manchester. I think what I was really conscious of as a kind of boy growing up in this city that had been hollowed out economically by a declining industry in the city was you had this incredible humanism embedded, and this incredible vision embedded in these great buildings in Manchester, and many of them were being pushed over, they were being knocked down, they were being removed, and yet there were certain buildings that had this resilience. They just could not go away, and they had these second or third lives to them. And this is a really kind of resounding image to me, because it reminds me of how I walked around my city with my parents and experienced architecture in a very, very different climatological, cultural, economic way. And I think it's these two very different points of view, these resolving of two oppositional points of view, that we come to make a studio.
So I know that we agreed that I would ask this later, but I think I can help asking it now. So you are two directors that come from very different cities.
Yeah.
Are your roles kind of complementary, or what's the roles of these two directors in the studio?
I'd like to be very clear. It's a great shame Kevin couldn't be sat on stage with me, because we would be arguing like cat and dog at the moment, as we do in the studio. I think we are both design directors in the practice. We both wanted to become architects to somehow have a greater or lesser influence on things in the physical world, building spaces, places. And so our process of working together is really important. And I'd like to touch on this theme of thinking through making in the talk.
Yeah, later on.
And we work in a very collegiate way in the studio. And models are one of our methods of not having one point of view, one master's sketch, one instructive way of doing things. It's a process where many people have a point of view on the process.
So let's jump to the second topic, which is two masters at once. I I love this sentence.
That's not referring to Kevin and I.
So, well, I guess that all of us along our lives have met people that maybe we have just shared a short conversation, or maybe they have been our professors or our masters. Actually, I can see some of them in this room, in my case, Elias Torres or Ramon Sanabria. So for a short or long time, our paths have crossed and they suddenly become influential people to us. So if I'm not wrong, Kevin and you met in Chipperfield's studio,
That's right,
and
yeah.
we can be talking about these two masters at once.
So Olga and I discussed talking about influences and people, and we thought that this pairing of influential people would be really good to talk about, amongst other tutors that I've had, which I'll talk about later. So Kevin and I were very, very lucky to be working for a client called Anthony Gormley, a internationally renowned sculptor, and he commissioned David Chipperfield, our then boss at the time, to design his studio. So in a sense, we were working in this kind of apprenticeship situation between, you know, working for architect David Chipperfield and artist Anthony Gormley, and it gave us a very interesting perspective. I mean, some of the things that we've learnt from working in David's practice, you know, is this unshiftable interest in the strength, the power of being in the presence of architecture, the interest in the presence of architecture as a physical thing. I think David's methodologies and David's design practice really taught us a certain kind of humility to balance a number of different things simultaneously, a constructive, a spatial, an architectural and an urbanistic idea simultaneously. And when all of those things were somehow reconciled, then you know, the project came into being. So I think, you know, we learned about making projects that were a conciliation of purpose and place and founded in an experience of architecture itself. Whereas at the same time, we were learning from this incredible artist who saw the world through a very precise lens. He had a very particular way of looking at things, about the body in space, about the presence of one's own body and another's presence, and the presence of the body in physical space and architectural space, but also the idea of recording a lived moment of time as well in physical terms. How art makes sense of us being physically in the world. So I think we had this incredible privilege to be working on a commission which was really about, on one hand, an instrument, for a tool for making this artist's work. The building was a tool of a certain type, but also at the same time it was a series of spaces that helped the artist to imagine making work in different ways. So it was this reconciliation of the emotional and the pragmatic and the detail and the spatial, which I think when Kevin and I were working together on this project taught us an enormous amount.
And you've mentioned one of the key points actually in all of your work, this question of time. Actually, I think it sets a kind of continuity all along the work of your study, from temporary installations to exhibitions, pavilions, memorials. Also, there's a question of time in memorials. So I think that in all of them, there's this kind of very strong component of time, which introduces to the next slide, and here I would ask you, I mean, how do you approach this paradox of temporary and permanent architecture?
So the way we've set this slideshow up is maybe a precedent, a research image, and a project that we've been involved in doing on the other side of the page. So this is an image that we refer to an incredible amount in the studio, actually, and it's Sir Edwin Lutyens walking away from the cenotaph, the most important war memorial in Britain. It was opened in 1919, and this photograph shows Sir Edwin Lutyens walking away from that memorial and leaving the visitors to ponder what it means. The memorial was to commemorate the 1 million dead in the Great War, and is a sort of a physical nexus for people to come together and make sense of their times. And that, to us, is a really appealing thing about this image. It also has an incredible inherent paradox in this image. When you look at this image and you look at that as a monument, you think this is a permanent monument. It's made of stone. It's actually made of plaster and wood. It's a temporary mock-up to test whether a monument is required. A year later, such was the need for this monument that it was reconstructed in Portland stone. So I think this presumed tendency for architecture to be permanent is quite paradoxical when you look at this image alone. You need an explanation to understand that. But even notwithstanding the fact that this was a temporary test of an idea, being in the presence of a physical place, togetherness, the one being amongst the many, was so important for making sense of our times that it's such a resounding image reminds us of the potential of the power of being in the presence of architecture. The image on the right-hand side is a pavilion that we worked with as an ongoing project with Anthony Gormley. We claim no artistic identity for this. It's another research project of sorts. We were the architects to help Anthony make this happen. As I said, Anthony was concerned with the body in space and the presence of the visitor, making sense of themselves amongst others. And this was not just a theoretical piece of research, it was a practical piece of research where we sort of saw it as an anthropological experiment of how people behave towards one another, the singular amongst the collective, the fact that you could only understand this experience of walking into freezing cold fog and getting completely disorientated and losing all of your Cartesian coordinates of the world and therefore becoming super aware of your own self was an incredibly important project to be involved in, to have been involved in that piece of research, to take on to other projects about the presence of the visitor amongst other visitors, making sense of the work.
Maybe like in the next project, like the 7th Memorial, you mean? Or because I think that in that one, this idea of time happens to be in quite a different way. Maybe it's this idea of lasting or not forgetting.
This was probably one of the most profound experiences that we have ever had working as architects. Partly because it was such a profound and abrupt event in London's history, of which we were an observer and a participant at the time, and partly because we had to we had to, on winning the commission for this project, work in such an unusual way with such an unusual client. On the left-hand side is until our memorial was completed, it was the only sort of way of remembering the event through the image of the bus that was exploded above her. It's the only image available. The 3 other bombs that were detonated on that morning of 7th of July were all detonated underground. And yet this image alone wasn't seen to be a long-lasting enough reminder in physical terms. So an Act of Parliament was passed to make a physical memorial. And what really occurred to us, we won the commission against 8 other artists. We didn't know we were competing against architects or artists. And we were told afterwards that one of the reasons we were selected, we had no preconceived idea when we went in to make the competition presentation. We simply proposed a process of listening and understanding, like we do on all of our architectural projects, of making a conciliation of place and purpose. And the families who were our client, the 52 bereaved families, clients that didn't want to be clients, thought that that was so humble that, in contrast to the 8 other artists who proposed an object or a thing or a sculpture that somehow was supposed to sum up all of their complex emotions, the architect's process was very, very different to the artist's process. And we keep oscillating between how the architect's contract with their work is somehow ever so slightly different with the artist's contract and their work. It's a concurrent reminder of working on this project. So we, if we could move to the next image, we made an image. Well, we couldn't really use the image of the exploded bus, the detonated bomb on the bus, as a symbol of reconciliation, and rather we founded the image of the memorial as 52 individual elements making a collective whole, a sculpture in the park. And somehow that had a very kinetic registration with the place, the park. It was somehow in this tradition of picturesque, of this ruin in the landscape, of this thing that was almost it didn't really have a sort of contemporary age to it, because it was there for generations to come, to stop people forgetting. So we almost imagined this rather like the kind of the image of the Claude Lorraine painting, in this kind of picturesque tradition of the ruin in the landscape and this disaggregated composition of architecture and landscape, and making the experience of the memorial at the eye level of the city, the presence of the visitor, the living visitor, wandering into this field of 52 elements that represent the dead, made sense. Completed the message of the memorial, the living amongst the dead. So, once again, the research of the Anthony Gormley Blind Light Pavilion, of this, the one and the many, and being in the presence of architecture was embedded in this very, very early project within our studio.
Now that you're mentioning this experience, through the memorial, I remember these sketches, these hand-drawing sketches of the movement of the people. So I guess this was part of the process of the project, maybe?
I think we wanted the families and we wanted this to be an interpretive, an open piece of architecture in the park where you could freely wander into the memorial and ponder its meaning, and also by the way it was made, how the physical presence of the architecture had some almost magnetic presence in itself. We on the right-hand side is the finished memorial, a fragment of it. It's cast in 1 ton ingots of stainless steel. It was a very particular choice for the material, which has many many points of view why we came to that conclusion for the material, but we wanted it to have a highly unusual presence, almost kind of magnetizing you to wanting to touch and engage in the presence of this thing. We wanted to play with the resonance of the stainless steel being a material of the city of London, of the commercial city, but make it in a way that it was cast, not engineered. So using a very archaic technique, we went into an almost molecular level of research on the material properties of stainless steel. It liquefies at 1600 degrees centigrade, which is twice the temperature of a normal casting metal bronze, about 800 degrees centigrade. And it solidifies within a very, very small temperature region, and it solidifies, it takes its form in 6 seconds. And we were incredibly interested in the poetics of this element, 1 ton of stainless steel taking its form in an explosive instant. What happens with this open cast technique is that you get all of the turbulence of pouring metal from one end, both ends, and it just giving you the form that it takes in those 6 seconds. So with one wooden former pressed into sand 52 times, the one makes the many, the singular makes the collective. So there's a poetic idea about the construction of this abstract piece of architecture, but it has only elements of architecture. It has none of the normal tenets of architecture, which is comfort and shelter. It offers none of that deliberately. All its purpose is as a piece of architecture, which is very unusual, I think, as to work on as a commission as an architect, is to draw attention to this piece of architecture for generations to come and stop people forgetting. It got us thinking that actually our client was perhaps a little bit more than just our commissioning client. It was a bit more than the onlooker in the park. It was society as a whole for generations to come. And in a sense, I think that really focused us on a certain duty that we have as architects, as young architects. Then we were only 3 years old as a practice. It was designed to last 250 years, and we had certain predictions about how it was supposed to be used. It was meant to be used for great ceremonies. Here are the two architects of Brexit, wandering through the memorial on one of the anniversary days. What's interesting on the image on the right-hand side is that we have some graffiti from we were told Islamic protesters who did certain tags to add 4 other innocent victims to this list of 52, the perpetrators of the bomb, the detonators of the bombs themselves. What's interesting not is the tags themselves, who did it, what it was, but it's this topic of use and misuse in architecture that I think we all have to get to grips with. This idea that when, as Edwin Lutyens walks away from his project, it gets thought about and used in ways that you imagine and ways that you couldn't imagine. So I think this is always coming in and out of focus for us about the idea of the anthropology of a project, but also what different lives it can take on, and you know, its fragility as an initial idea in physical form.
And I think that this makes me think a little bit about the next topic, which is this idea of process and technique. A couple of years ago, if you remember, it was a couple of years ago?
Yeah.
Time runs fast. So a couple of years ago, I invited your studio, Kevin and you, to this series of exhibitions and lectures in Girona, and to think about this idea of technique. I mixed architects like Anna and Eugenie and your studio with other disciplines, like the musicians Cabo San Roque or the film director Albert Serra. And to all of them, I was asking them what technique meant to them. I remember that Albert Serra was saying that technique is anything but inspiration. And you and Kevin, remember that you were saying that architecture is, which can only do so much with its limited vocabulary and use of space, light, and materials. So, Andy, what's your approach to architecture?
I think we enjoy the physical limitations of architecture, and we enjoy speculating with those limits, those physical limits. We place thinking through making at the heart of our studio process, and that started right at the beginning. And the image on the right-hand side is a model that we were making for a fragment of a very large building competition only last week. The image on the left-hand side is a really important image to my education as an architect. At this point, I think you were talking about characters and influences before. My professor at university, Professor Peter Blundell-Jones, was teaching a history module that 10 students and I joined to look at the alternative tradition of modernism in Hans Scharoun's work. And we made models only for reconstructed, unbuilt projects of Hans Scharoun for a whole semester, because Hans Scharoun's drawings are so quite opaque to understand spatially. They have to be experienced in physical form. Like the Philharmonie in Berlin, and this was the antecedent to that project, the unbuilt theatre competition in Mannheim. I think and there was a few things that I learned on this project. The importance of learning through precedent, through history, and also the importance of thinking through making, but also in Hans Scharoun's work, particularly this an alternative tradition of modernism, which placed the visitor or placed the occupant of a piece of architecture right at the center of the experience. Hans Scharoun's buildings are notoriously difficult to photograph. They have a rather filmic quality where you must move around them to understand. And in this particular theatre, we had to reconstruct these models to understand the project spatially. And so this idea of thinking and designing through making in this very democratic process of students working together to make a joint piece of research has been embedded in the studio process, where a model has no one point of view. Many points of view can be taken of it, so many people's opinion can be put into the process. And also the fact that we're working on one tiny slice of what goes into making an entire building, I think it's important to place oneself within that process, but also place that oneself in that process with the concept of designing with others. And that's necessary designing with two directors. It's necessary designing with a very collegiate studio, a very talented kind of and motivated and ambitious architects.
Yeah, and it seems to me, just listening you just before when we were looking at the seventh memorial, how you were describing this kind of materiality and how it was executed. Or now seeing this model these models in your studio, it seems to me that if we think about your creative process, the creative process of your studio, it's kind of handcrafted. Is it? I'm getting this wrong, or I'm right?
I think whether you can put the two words hand and crafted together, I think it's important that projects stay as close as they can to the craft of architecture. I think as projects get bigger and more complex, they become more codified in the way that they're built. So you have to employ, necessary systems, drawing types, to make buildings, to make ideas into constructed reality. I think it's really important that at all stages we stay as close as we can to the speculations of materials and how they go together, and stay true to those values of being in the presence of physical things in the experience of architecture. Materials are very important design choices at all stages, from concept to completion in the project.
So is this something that comes very early in the process?
I think it's coming from, it's coming as early as the first conversations about the site. Wow. Yeah.
It doesn't change?
I think, well, once again, it's one of those things that come in and out of focus in the design of a project, and I think you're always trying to find the common denominator of the problem in constructive or spatial or organizational terms to make this project make sense. So I think a constructive idea or how materials aid that spatial description of an idea is incredibly important.
And I mean, at the very beginning, when you started as a practice, the first works, maybe all of them, most of them, were temporary exhibitions or pavilions. And as I was telling you, or as Omar said, just today, 1 month ago, I lectured my PhD, and the PhD was about the German section by Mies van der Rohe and Lily Reich at the International Exhibition in 1929. And they built it up, 16,000 square meters of exhibitions plus the pavilion in 2 months. And I remember that one of the most stunning things about this story is when, in the very last week, Mies is kind of desperate, and he writes this letter to the curator, and he says, listen, we're not going to make it. I'm really sorry. I mean, we have run out of time. There's no time left, so there's no time for prestige or for detail. And this makes me think, I mean, when I look at this project, the dining, I think that this kind of reminds me of this, I mean, these kind of temporary projects are projects that where usually you don't have budget, you don't have time, and there's this kind of very intensive creative process, that I think that it gives a kind of freedom.
I think temporary architecture, well, I think all architecture has a temporal value, temporal concerns to it. I think I would challenge the notion that there is any such thing as permanence in architecture, and if there is, permanence is a real privilege.
Yeah, that's true.
But in any case, I would say probably 40%, maybe more, of our built portfolio has probably been taken down already. That's a point of pride. It's not a point of regret. This is probably one of the most extreme examples of that way of building. This was built in 2010, overlooking the largest construction site in the whole of Europe at the time. In the background, you can see some of the skyline of London. In the near ground, you can see some of the stadia that were being built for the 2012 Olympics. In the foreground, you can see a car park, 8 stories high, 35 meters in the air, above the mud of the construction site. On top of that car park, you can see an 800 square meter pavilion, which was built from first briefing with the client to opening night for a restaurant events celebration, built in only 10 weeks for less cost than your average London house extension that a young architect cuts their teeth on for their new practice. We were using this opportunity to test ideas of architecture. We were 3 years old as a practice, and we wanted to build. We really wanted to make work. We were asked to dress a wedding marquee, and we said we would do that for this event. And we said, but there's another way of doing this. There's a way of making a temporary piece of architecture that can be built for the same amount of money. I think as young architects, you need tactics to make things happen, and sometimes you need to stretch the truth a little bit. We almost achieved that budget, but I think what we elected to do in that process is stay true to only one or two architectural ideas about the purpose of this building, which was a congregational space. And so we saw it rather like a really unself-conscious test of an idea. We refer to the Becker's typology series of this architecture, which sort of makes sense from its own internal logic, and there's a sort of unself-conscious beauty to the forms, but which are based in a fundamental kind of reason for being in their purpose. This was really a series of interlinked dining rooms that were coming together in a constellation of rooms that faced views. That was the architectural idea. This was the model that we made on the left-hand side. After that, we went to live in a scaffold yard for 3 weeks and learn how to make temporary architecture with temporary works. There was no way on earth we would have built in any other methodology. So I guess it's understanding the vernacular constructive ideas of a problem. I don't mean vernacular in sort of geographic terms. I mean vernacular, you need to get, in this sense, in this project, to the common denominator of the issues of how to build quickly. And the physical perfection of these spaces was less important than the realization of the spatial idea and people being able to come together atop a rather daring site to view this, to sample a moment in time in London's history. That was more important than whether we got all the junctions of all of the materials dead on. And in fact, it even helped making a very unself-conscious environment where people felt even more relaxed. So in a sense, these projects are drawing a red thread through these temporary and more long-lasting projects. They build up this kind of almost architectural but also anthropological toolkit of ideas, of tests, of successful tests and not so successful tests of how architectural spaces are made and how people use or misuse them.
Yeah, I think that another project which shows this kind of hunter attitude or surfer attitude is the filling station, I would say. I mean, what catches me more about this project is what I call the happy accident spirit. I'm really interested in this idea of the accident as something that you catch as an opportunity. I'm always, when I'm lecturing, I'm always showing this, well, you remember it, this scene of Woody Allen's Match Point film where there's this ball that's touching the top of the net, and for a second you don't know what's going to happen, if it's going to. But then we were also talking before about this, and we're saying that in order to have a match point situation, you need to risk a bit. And I think that in this case, this project, it catches perfectly this kind of happy accident spirit. It seems to me that the filling station has exactly this kind of aim, or it's a temporary project that tests an emerging urbanism, a fragile moment that sees the opportunity and finally offers a new view of a place and reveals a new view of a forgotten piece of the city, as it was this side of the river. And this ephemeral pop-up installation radically changed the reality of a place. So this kind of ephemeral moment, this kind of fragile moment, at the end offers a kind of long-term view of the city, which I think that it's... So can you tell us a bit about this experience? How, I mean, I think that it's really interesting how, I mean, the whole commission started, you know? So it's a kind of auto-commission, I would say.
Well, I've been told on many occasions this is a very London project. This is a project that sort of could only come out of making work in London. So put simply, it's a restaurant and a cultural event space in a disused petrol station. It's in a part of King's Cross, a very large, now complete master plan of north central London, developer-led master plan. But at the time, this was at the far reaches, at the limits of this master plan. No one would go to this petrol station, this disused petrol station on the outskirts of King's Cross. It was a dangerous area. This wasn't a commission to begin with. It was born out of a frustration by us as architects that we'd lost 3 consecutive competitions with this developer to be awarded the chance to build within this master plan. So out of pure frustration, we, finding out a pocket of disused marketing budget that the developer had, we thought we'd make a business plan for a project. And we took the business plan and the project and the operator for the restaurant as an oven-ready proposal to the developer and say, look, you won't make a penny of deficit here. And what this will do is it will enable you to test ideas about an emerging urbanism, as you say. The developer chose to take a risk on the project. The project was built, it was very successful, it was taken away in 3 years' time. I think I have to pay testament to another tutor I had at my university who really, in my final 2 years of studying in a rather traditional Beaux-Arts style education, plan, section, program, pictorial, pin-up, crit. This tutor, Haru Morishima, Mog as he was known, deconstructed the whole notion of what kind of projects and how architecture should be taught in schools of architecture, and thought rather more like Cedric Price, rethinking, you know, what we build and even why we build from first principles, and ran a project called Food Culture, and my project at the end of that semester was a restaurant and a petrol station by complete coincidence. I think the idea that you can place yourself in the culture of how you build architecture in different ways is so important as working within a place like London. You have to be, in a sense, like-minded with the system with which you're kind of complicit, but then at the same time understand the mechanisms by which you're not just leveraging land value for a client. You're doing something interesting socially, culturally, and testing ideas about urbanism. When this project was complete, it completely remediated a very dangerous kind of canal towpath, and showed a certain roadmap to certain ways of thinking about how this place could be used in different ways. So I think even though this was a temporary piece of architecture speculating an urban use as well as a sort of spatial use for this site, and like Ed Ruscha painting sort of monumentalizing the sort of the subcultural elements of the city, thinking at the sort of grassroots of the problem and making an architectural project out of a certain inevitability of how people may behave in that place.
So I think that if in the case of the filling station, there's this moment which at the end ends up transforming a landscape in the city, I think that maybe Windermere is the next museum, is the next step. No? It's the case where there's a real intertwined between landscape and architecture. Le Corbusier used to say that architecture would move from being subjected to nature being logarithm of architecture, which means that architecture in the future would be based on nature. So I think that could be maybe the case of Windermere Museum.
Yeah, I think the Windermere Museum has a very particular relationship with its place and a rather aggressive environment where nature is eventually taking over architecture and reclaiming architecture. If we look at the image on the left-hand side, there's a certain interest in things moving fast and slow. This is the collection of the Boat Museum. Eventually, after 40 years, these speedboats that you see and the steamboats are alongside the original museum buildings. The building was originally opened in 1977, are being reclaimed by nature. And I think the starting point of our project was to make architectural interventions like-minded with this environment, to place a building well, environmentally, culturally, in this place was at the heart of all of our proposals for this project. The project is finishing in a week's time, so I don't have many photographs of it, but it's taken 7 years to build. So rather unlike the earlier temporary projects, yeah. We've been moving a little bit more like the steamboat than the speedboat on this project. These are two images of the history of this particular place. Windermere is the largest lake in the UK, in the northwest of England, rather near where I was brought up, and it shows high architecture. It shows rich merchants' houses being built on the lake shore. This was a place it's a playground for the rich, and it has a very picturesque tradition of painting and poetry and literature, and of high architecture. This is a house, very famous house by Voisey, that's just built up the road from the museum. It has embedded in it all of this picturesque history of the vernacular. And I think what's interesting about the vernacular in locational topical terms is the roof seems to be the most local element in all architecture. It seems to describe the first principles of shelter. So we were very interested in this topic of roofs and how high architecture had equipped itself to come up with identity in this Voisey project of the big overhanging eaves, the big inside-outside spaces beneath, and these kind of very pronounced topographical changes. At the same time, so we were looking at the picturesque history of the site And we were looking also at the working history of the site. So once again, taking these oppositional points of view to reconcile into one, to synthesize into one architectural idea. So the image on the right-hand side is the steamboat museum before it was a steamboat museum in a gravel extraction plant, taking minerals, dragging minerals from the lake bed and pulling them out of the lake and sifting them and selling them. So this was a working history. And what we wanted to do with our project is not be pejorative or loaded about high architecture over low architecture. We wanted to hold all of the histories of the site in equal balance. And we thought this idea of the typology of industrial or agricultural or vernacular shelter was really important to the identity of this piece of architecture.
And I guess that in this sense that you're speaking, materiality maybe also came at the very beginning of these first thoughts?
We made a mistake at the beginning of this project. When we pitched this competition, we showed a stainless steel building because we'd been really lucky that the stainless steel 7th of July memorial had gone well. It looked so good in its park setting. It held light in a very, very beautiful, ethereal way, rather like Anthony Gormley's Fog Pavilion. And we thought this must be a bright white thing on the lake shore. And then we thought, after working on this site for 4 seasons, we were really committed to this stainless steel. After working on the site for 4 seasons, we realized nothing can be stainless in this wet, aggressive environment. And so the idea of material we had to completely transfigure into something that was more working a little bit more with the inevitabilities of the way the building was made, the maker's marks, but also the way the building would inevitably weather.
I think that, I mean, going back to this, what we were talking about of this intertwine between landscape and architecture, I think that in this museum, there's 2 different ways of intertwining nature and architecture. From the outside, we have this kind of intermediate spaces, these porches which are framing the landscape.
Yeah.
But in the opposite way, we could say that from the inside, the shore is coming inside, you know, to bring this kind of nature into the building.
Yeah, I mean, the thesis of this project was, I think museums occupy quite a difficult challenge for an architect. They on one hand, they seem to be a commission which is really attractive to get because you've got a really good meeting of minds with a client over values of creating a high quality cultural building and, you know, built with interesting materials and blah blah. At the same time, there's a culture with I don't know the Bilbao effect of museums to regenerate economic activity in a place, that somehow they have to have the status of being iconographic. And I'm suspicious of that. I'm suspicious that architecture can do economic regeneration. I think I'm more hopeful that architecture can aid in some way in a kind of social regeneration of bringing people together to experience things. And I think in this particular beautiful location on the lake shore, we wanted a building that was somehow simultaneously foreground and background, and somehow it always was coming in and out of focus what the subject of the experience was. And, you know, we return to those paintings of Claude Lorraine where there is an equilibrium of landscape and architecture, and architecture almost depicted as the ruin, as this imperfect object that can never be perfect in this location. And so the idea that, you know, inevitably the character of the building had to come out of shelter. We had to make architecture that sheltered a collection. But the building, more often than not, just framed views from land to water and water to land and connected people from land to water and from boats from land to water as well. So it was more of a kind of vivid frame of experience, and it was thought of in those spatial terms and almost like a walk around the park than in object terms.
I know that we have been,
and
yeah,
then
the
so
materiality.
just on the topic of materials, we looked more towards fast forwarding the building into the future and looking at its inevitable decay. We looked at buildings by Alto that were done mid-century last year, and looking back, looking forward, looking at materials, how they'll be in several generations to come. The design life of this building is 70 years. So what will this building look like in 70 years? We elected to use a natural metal, a copper, which registered the passage of time and its weathering and its maker's marks. It begins with this kind of rather lovely dark oxidized finish. The dark object frames the light view to the landscape beyond. So the architecture is always this sort of frame for other experiences, but eventually it will be encrusted with these oxidized particles, which will turn parts, not all, but parts of the building into this kind of verdigris patination. So the building will melt into the landscape. Nature will recolonize the architecture.
I think that here we're touching a issue which I think it's very interesting in the sense that we've been talking a lot about materiality, but it's also interesting to think about materiality in terms of time. Some years ago, I was teaching with Cecilia Puga, and Cecilia Puga was always talking about these two different opposites or conditions, the membrane and the shell. And she was talking about nomad architecture versus the permanent one, a question of time that was strongly related to materiality. I would say that some of your projects are membranes, and while others, like this, what we've seen in the 7th July Memorial, are intended to last, not to be forgotten. And others, as we've just seen now in the Windermere Museum, will age in a natural environment. The next project that we're going to show, I would say, could we say it's a kind of, well, membrane?
The project, before I introduce it, is in the context of the second devastating fire of Charles Rennie Mackintosh's Glasgow School of Art. This is, it's almost burnt to the ground. And it's one of the most important, was one of the most important pieces, well, it was the most important piece of Charles Rennie Mackintosh's architecture without equal. It was also one of the most important parts of UK architectural 20th century culture as well. It's in the context of that fire and the devastation of this building that we're been invited to reconsider the fate of another Charles Rennie Mackintosh building. What I wanted to say about the Glasgow School of Art is I would probably pay testament to a visit to this building as a kind of 12-year-old with my father to sort of refocus or focus an interest in architecture as a career. My father was a textile designer, and and I wanted to follow his path, but he refocused that in the work of a designer, artist, architect that sort of did all of those things really. And it's in that context that I think that had I not visited this school, I wouldn't have understood the work of Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And once again, it's the importance of being in the presence of that experience of architecture to understand the work of Charles Rennie Mackintosh that is vital to the conception of his work. So if it is important to understand Charles Rennie Mackintosh and his life's work, then I think there is a kind of case for reconstruction of some sort of this school of art.
Yeah, I think that, one of the, maybe, just listening what you're saying now, I think that us as a generation, one of our challenges is seeing how we can preserve our heritage. And I would say that, there could be many ways how we could approach this issue. One of them, we could understand or see ourselves as collectors, where architecture, once it has lost its function and it becomes, it acquires another kind of value, it can be understood, as a museum piece. Is that the approach in this case? Because, I think that there's another way of understanding this, which would be to provide new creative uses, for example, to this, to the heritage, and which is it's something that maybe happens in other of your projects.
Yeah.
But in this case, it would be the first one.
Well, I think the challenge of this project is to reimagine a future for Charles Rennie Mackintosh's Hill House, the most important residential work. 5 minutes. The most important residential work surviving. Here it is in all its white modernist glory. On the right-hand side, 1904, it was completed in 1904. Here it is the day before it closed last year. And here Mackintosh is experimenting with a new material as a young architect, as a 28-year-old young man, looking farther afield than Glasgow, where the house is built, to Southern European modernism, to borrowing materials, emerging materials, and experimenting with them, and using cement render for the emerging, modernism of the early 20th century rather than lime render. The building has failed. The render has cracked. Water has got in. Water has not got out, and it's a 115-year-old sandstone sponge, and it will not survive more than 2 winters. So our project reimagines a future for this by creating a field hospital of sorts and buying some time. Time is the important factor in this project. We're buying time to think about what to do with this important piece of architecture. The important thing about where the National Trust for Scotland have seen dwindling figures in this house, have seen dwindling interest in this house over the last 20 years since they've owned it. And so there's a philosophical problem of who this has meaning for, and not just why we should retain it. So our project reimagines an architectural experience of sorts, where we create a visitor experience within a field hospital where a conservation project can take place. So this is a rather sort of analogous approach to Cedric Price's Fun Palace, where the activity of the visitor experiences a rather more kinetic and movable series of apparatus around what is a very pragmatic building envelope, a very elemental skeleton that goes up and creates a working environment and a solid roof, in great contrast to the solidity of architecture. It's a skeleton. Within that framework are threaded visitor routes, so visitors can come in and ponder the meaning of this conservation work and have conversations like we're just having now about why retain an old crumbling building. The membrane has its own architectural identity and has been debated at great length about what that is, and it's a stainless steel chainmail, which creates the perfect drying room environment that attenuates the rain, the weather, but allows wind to blow all the way through it. This is another crazy fast project. This started on site just before Christmas. It will be finished within 1 month. On the right-hand side of this image is the craftsman in Stuttgart that is weaving the piece of chainmail that will completely enshroud this building forever.
So I think that here we're seeing strategies and tactics again, no? In this case about creating this kind of experience that maybe, again, an ephemeral, a fragile moment, no? Which is where this installation, this nomad installation is there, maybe it will preserve at a long-term view this piece of heritage. So again, it connects a bit with other projects that we've just seen.
It gives a chance to sustain life.
Exactly.
It captures a moment of lived time of this building, and it buys some time as a piece of architecture to have a think and discuss what is the best thing to do with the building in the future.
So just before we jump to the last one, we can go very quickly in this one, but I would just like to have a short word about beauty. Beauty, said Agnes Martin, is our positive response to life. It's not in the eye, it's in the mind. Some days ago, I was reading this interview of the graphic designer Stefan Sagmeister, and he was also talking about beauty. He said that after 100 years of being refused or considered as a taboo, now it was again time for beauty. Do you believe that? Do you think it's now time again for beauty?
It's not a subject we talk about often in relation to the work. I think why is that? I think it's a subjective thing, and it touches on topics of taste. And I think we're in a time where topics of taste do not have one orthodoxy. We're not in a kind of post-Enlightenment period where the Grand Tour goes to look over antiquities, come back and build in the manner of those antiquities, as if it was some orthodox view of what is good. What is the correct taste to discuss when you're talking about beauty? I think that our buildings, our projects, somehow become both foreground and background. So sometimes they're not seen. They're a framework for providing other experiences, and I think that's one of the qualities that I think we really try and foster in the projects, that they're not always that they're not in of themselves always they're not defined by their own physical terms. They're frameworks for other experiences to be had within them or around them.
And before we end, let's talk just a little bit about future. Yeah, we cannot leave this topic. As we all are aware, our world is changing really fast. We need to adapt to these big changes that we are experiencing. It's said that in 2050, the 66% of the world inhabitants will be living in cities. Our length of life will be around 150 years, and technology is evolving exponentially. Seeing this panorama, I would like to know, Andy, how are you imagining our future in terms of architecture, of course?
I think I'm going to return to one of the earlier slides in the presentation, and oscillating between the spatial, architectural, and the urbanistic. And I think as cities are becoming increasingly densified, as the world is becoming increasingly urbanized and densified, we need to think about those environments that create the right infrastructures to sustain human life, but to improve human life and create humane environments such that, rather like the image on the right-hand side, but in a very different way, create create environments that are tolerant for life, to sustain and improve life. And I think infrastructure is very important. I think I'm becoming increasingly aware that architecture can do so much, and that the decisions at a political or economic scale and those powers of planning are so important for our cities to, in the case of London particularly, work within an environment which creates a dynamic culture of building and rebuilding and fulfilling needs for a densifying society, increasing urban environment, but can also be a player in moderating the systems and to be like-minded with those mechanisms by which development happens in cities like London, but moderate them in urban plan terms so that we're not just working for the metrics of one agenda.
So should we leave it here, or you?
Well, one of the ways we're seeing that happen in a project that is we're developing at the moment is in the town that I originally trained at University Sheffield, where one of the most impressive social housing projects of the 20th century was built. It's the biggest listed building in the whole of Europe. It had 950 odd social housing apartments. And in the 1980s, once again, when the local industry and economy was being dismantled, the social structure of this building was had broken down, and the building was decommissioned. We're now at a point where we're looking back on a project which has come to its original being with a consensus, with a conciliation of massive economic and political power, the likes of which we haven't really seen ever since in the UK. And we're being asked to imagine a small part of the rehabilitation of that project into new housing structures and a purpose-built fine art gallery and artist studio. So making a much more pluralistic mix, not such a monoculture of use, but working within what seems to be the resilient part of this project, the structural frame, that thing that you just can't rub away, that thing that is taken into the next lifespan of architecture.
Great. Andy, thank you so much for your time, for your views, and for your work. And thank you to Apara for inviting us and sharing this time with all of you.
Thank you.